They buried our names, rewrote our legacy. But through the ashes, the blood still speaks. From Moorish courts to Louisiana sugar fields, this is the true story they tried to erase. Nobility, reclassified, royalty enslaved. Yet the fire never died. It lives in the bloodline. This is more than history. It's restoration. It's reclamation. It's truth. Bloodlines of Fire. Available now on Amazon KDP.
So today, we're going to talk about the suppression of Hoodoo and Creole religious practice in Louisiana during the slavery era. So during Louisiana's slavery era, white supremacist authorities and governments took concentrated legal and cultural action to repress Hoodoo and related FBA Creole religious practices. Even though Louisiana Hoodoo was never explicitly outlawed as a name religion, its practice was still heavily restricted by law and demonized in popular culture. This story provides a more historical overview of those suppressive measures, from colonial decrees, even all the way up to state laws, to court cases and police raids, to inflammatory media portrayals. We're gonna examine the racial fears and social political motives behind efforts to erase FBA Creole thrived fates in Louisiana. So let's take a look at the legal policies and laws that was targeting Hoodoo practitioners. Right from the offset, authorities sought to control and completely eliminate Hoodoo spiritual practices among the enslaved. French colonial law imposed the 1724 Code Noir, which basically was called Black Code. It recognized only Catholicism as the legitimate faith in Louisiana and required all enslaved foundational Black Americans to be baptized and instructed as Catholics. This code that they imposed effectively outlawed the open practice of any foundational Black American religions. The Code Noir, Black Code, and later Spanish rules, because Spain took control in 1760s, they forbidded enslaved people from gathering in groups without authorization, under threats of brutal punishment. Unapproved assemblies, such as clandestine ritual drummings or ceremonies, could deem illegal gatherings, punished by whippings for the first offense, and even branded or even executed for repeat offenses. In short, colonial law demanded religious conformity and strictly policed Black congregations to stifle any vestige of Hoodoo or Voodoo rites. After the United States acquired Louisiana in 1803, white America officials grew even more distrustful of foundational Black American spiritual traditions. Enslavers and lawmakers introduced new slave codes and local ordinance to curb Black assemblies. Notably, under U.S. rule, the long-standing practice of Sunday dance in New Orleans Congo Square, where enslaved and free people of color had gathered to drum, dance, and worship and syncretic fashion came under attack. In 1835, New Orleans authorities outlawed the traditional Sunday music and dancing at Congo Square, effectively banning the public impression of hoodoo and voodoo rituals for a time. This ban was loosened about a decade later, only to be reimposed more harshly in the 1850s. By 1856, the city council passed an ordinance making it unlawful for black people to even beat drums, blow horns, or hold unsanctioned dances in public. They called that immorality. They said that was indecent. Any gatherings of foundational black Americans was criminalized harshly. The law further required special permission forms from the mayor for any public ball or dance. These measures directly targeted the foundational black American religious dances and congregations, driving ceremonies out of sight to remote bayous or indoors. State authorities also later enacted statuses to criminalize hoodoo-related practices under other guises. For example, in 1887, state law banned practicing healing or medicine without a license. They used this to prosecute foundational black American healers. Then, in 1897, they had a city ordinance that outlawed fortune telling. These laws was an act of war by the United States government against foundational black Americans. Basically, while hoodoo was never banned outright in Louisiana, legal regimes during slavery used general laws. Laws like Catholic-only religious mandates, bans on black assemblies, curfews, and fraud or licensing laws to make practicing hoodoo extremely difficult and risky and damn near impossible. Now, let's touch on the enforcement and legal cases against hoodoo practitioners. These laws was not merely symbolic. They were enforced through raids, arrests, and court proceedings that treated hoodoo gatherings as criminal activity. Historical records from mid-19th century New Orleans show a spike in police crackdowns on hoodoo ceremonies. For example, on July 8th, 1850, police from the city's third municipality raided a secret hoodoo ceremony that had moved to a house near Lake Pontchartrain, coincidentally near the same Congo Square where the ancestors were singing dance. According to the New Orleans Weekly Delta, a group of brothers and sisters called Fair Daughters of Voodoo had been holding their rites at that location without interruption until law enforcement one night decided to sort them out and made a successful arrest. Several women were taken into custody. 7 dozens of foundational black Americans and some mixed race participants was hauled off to jail on charges of unlawful assembly and disorderly conduct. Now, there was a very prominent case from that 1850 raid involving a free woman of color. Her name was Bessie Toledano, identified in the paper as a leading hoodoo queen. Toledano and others was prosecuted by the Louisiana court system, where she protested that she was being persecuted for practicing the religion of her motherland. Despite her defense, the court treated the gathering as a public nuisance at best. The courts, they saw her as an evil witch, a demon. In one related 1850 court report, a woman even complained that a man had called out her name for the simple fact her religious practice was hoodoo, demonstrating how being labeled a hoodoo practitioner carried stigma and legal consequences. Now, throughout the 1850s and the 1860s, New Orleans newspaper document multiple raids. This is on record. Police routinely broke up St. John's Eve rituals or nighttime dancing, arresting leaders like Toledano and confiscating all their ritual objects. By one account, about 20 alleged practitioners was arrested in one single raid. Now, crackdowns like this had become common enough that the Daily Picayune noted it was the first voodoo meeting in years, implying earlier ones occurred before police made the arrest. After the Civil War, the 1860s, enforcement continued against those practicing hoodoo, often under laws against vagrancy, superstition, or unlicensed healing. Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen of New Orleans, largely avoided arrest. Legend suggested her political influence or police connections shielded her. But many lesser known foundational Black American women and men faced aggressive prosecution. In the late 19th centuries, courts drew huge crowds to sensationalize hoodoo trials. Newspapers noted that hundreds of spectators, they would pack the courtrooms to witness proceedings whenever a batch of hoodoo practitioners were arraigned. Some were charged with fraud for selling charms or telling fortunes. They even charged them with violating public order laws. Basically, they waged full-fledged war on foundational Black Americans for their religious practices. By leveraging these bogus charges, Louisiana officials systematically criminalized hoodoo practice, driving it underground or into disguised forms: herbal medicine, spiritual church meetings, etc. The consistent message from these cases was that FBA-derived religions had no legal place in Louisiana public sphere. Any open practice would land our Black asses in jail. With their use of cultural portrayals and fear-mongering in the media was a deadly weapon against foundational Black American religious practices. Cultural portrayals in the 18th and 19th century both reflected and reinforced the fear and repression of hoodoo. White-ran newspapers in Louisiana, they frequently published reports on voodoo orgies and midnight devil worshiping, stoking public heresy. These accounts painted hoodoo ceremonies as dangerously exotic and immoral. It helped justify the crackdowns. For instance, an 1850 Tom Picayune report described multiracial gatherings in scandalized terms. Women of all colors was in a habit of frequenting a house in the backwoods near the St. Bernard Canal to go through a great variety of superstitious rites in a meager style of dress. Basically, there was dress revealing, as you would say, like a stripper. They think that's evil when you're showing some breasts and some butt. When police raided the place, they confiscated a large quantity of non-essential paraphernalia. Banners, wands, enchanted rods. Such writings mock the religion as mere foolishness, nonsensual, while also sexualizing it, using sexuality as a way to demonize hoodoo religious practices. Newspapers routinely allege that hoodoo ceremonies degenerated into orgies and blood sacrifices. In an infamous 1874 piece titled Voodoo Nonsense, full particulars of the hell broth and the orgies, the Picayune gave a plain, unvarnished account of a St. John's Eve lakefront ritual. It was filled with a bunch of tongue-in-cheek skepticism and horror stories. They depicted hoodoo as both a hoax and a menace, a titillating story for readers that simultaneously affirm white fears that these hell broth rites threaten social order. Even ostensibly serious literature and art portrayed hoodoo in a sinister light. Here's the deal. 19th century travel writers and novelists, especially after the Haitian Revolution, described New Orleans hoodoo as a dark, pagan cult lurking in the city shadows. At the same time, popular imagination conflated hoodoo with sorcery and Satanism. For example, writer Lafcadio Hearn later accounts in the 1880s sensationalized voodoo with claims that practitioners worshiped the devil and engaged in primitive acts. He drew on decades of local folklore that cast hoodoo as the ultimate other and occult evil at the heart of New Orleans. Cartoons and illustrations in the periodical press showed voodoo priests as wild-eyed conjurers wielding snakes and dolls. White audiences were enthralled and appalled by these depictions in equal measure. Importantly, negative portrayals also came from abolitionist circles in some cases. As one historian notes, even certain anti-slavery writers were racist and attacked hoodoo, claiming slavery had debased foundational Black Americans so much that they reverted to irrational superstitions and demon worship. In both pro-slavery and anti-slavery discourse then, hoodoo was framed as evidence of Black primitive or moral deficiency. These cultural narratives splashed across newspapers, novels, and later minstrel shows served to demonize hoodoo publicly, making it easier for authorities to crack down with broader public approval. White supremacist motivations and fears behind the superstitions underlying these legal and cultural attacks were deep-seated white supremacist fears of foundational Black American derived religions. White slave owners and officials perceived hoodoo and voodoo as a direct threat to the racial hierarchy and social order. See, several factors drove this fear. Memories of the Haitian Revolution scared the crap out of these white supremacists. The success of Haiti's slave uprising in 1791 and 1804 loomed large in Louisiana. The Haitian Revolution was famously ignited by voodoo ceremonies, like the voice chiming rituals, after which enslaved people overthrew their master through the practice of their religion. When thousands of refugees, white planters as well as free people of color and slaves, fled Haiti to Louisiana, they carried grim tales attributing the rebellion to devil-worshipping wild slaves empowered by voodoo. This installed terror in Louisiana white population that hoodoo may be used to foment a slave insurrection. Indeed, U.S. Governor William C. Claiborne expressed alarm at Haitians newcomers, and authorities monitored Black gatherings closely in case revolutionary ideas or rituals would spread. In this climate, any practice of hoodoo by the enslaved was seen not as harmless superstition, but as a potential rally point for a Black revolt. Suppression hoodoo was thus a counterinsurgence measure in the minds of white ruling class. Fear of Black autonomy and solidarity. Enslavers recognized that foundational Black American spiritual practice provide enslaved people a source of psychological strength and community bonding beyond white supremacist control. Hoodoo ceremonies allow slaves and free Blacks to congregate independently, reinforcing shared cultural identity and even political unity. To white supremacists, this was dangerous. One 1820 Louisiana Gazette article, cited by historians, complained of slaves and free people of color meeting to practice superstitions and adulterous rites, indicating white authorities' anxiety about any unsupervised Black spiritual life. White elites saw foundational Black American religious independence as incompatible with the slave system. As a result, they cast hoodoo as a subversive by definition. According to scholar N.E. Fanridge, 19th century white New Orleanians felt voodoo priestesses wielding alarming influence and power to invert the social hierarchy. In other words, the very idea that a hoodoo queen like Marie Laveau could command the obedience of Black followers and even exert influence over some whites was intolerable in a society built on white dominance. This fear of hoodoo as a powerful tool for the oppressed, fueled efforts to eradicate it. Racial purity and sexual panic. This was another reason for preservation of racial boundaries. Hoodoo gatherings in Louisiana was notably interracial at times. Enslaved blacks, free people of color, and even a few white participants are onlookers. Such mingling flew in the face of segregation. White observers often fixated on the sexual aspect of hoodoo ceremonies, alleging they led to interracial sexual orgies or promiscuity. This trope appeared repeatedly in newspapers, which denounced the scandalous mixing of white and persons of color dancing together. The sight of white women and men caught up in foundational Black American drumming and dance incited moral panic. Louisiana white authorities viewed hoodoo as a getaway for racial transgression, a direct threat to the social order of white over black. Like the 1856 ban on drums and dances were aimed not just at stopping religion, but at stopping interracial congregation. The Times-Picayune outraged editorials about hoodoo in the 1850s read strikingly like 1950s screeds against rock and roll, claiming that foundational Black American culture, music, and influence is corrupting white youth. In both cases, racist fear of cultural mixing was a driving force. Christianization and demonization. Now finally, the suppression of hoodoo was justified by casting it as heathen devil worship that had to be vanquished by Christianity. The French and Spanish slave regime saw conversion of Catholicism as part of their civilizing mission. The Code Nori, Black Code, explicitly sought to eradicate the corrupt customs of black savages, as colonial writings termed them. By law, the Catholic religion was the only religion foundational Black Americans could practice openly during slavery. If any foundational Black American was caught practicing hoodoo, they suffered severe and deadly consequences. Protestant attitudes even further vilified FBA religions. By the mid-19th century, white Louisiana society, dominated by Anglo-Saxon Americans, was far less tolerant of the same old practices. As one commentator noted, any gatherings of Black Americans was seen as potentially dangerous. But the drums, music, and chanting of hoodoo scared the living daylights out of them white supremacists. Hoodoo was categorized as devil worshiping, dripping in blood, superstition, and sexual deficiency. Portraying hoodoo as inadvertently evil served to rationalize harsh repression. After all, in the white supremacist view, they were protecting society, let them tell it, and even protecting the souls of black folks in a twisted mind by stamping foundational Black American religious practice as demonic. This framing also meant that even after slavery, during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, authorities could continue to persecute hoodoo practitioners under anti-witchcraft or public decency laws, largely with public approval. It's a fact. White supremacists use judicial laws, Catholicism, Christianity to demonize foundational Black American religious practices, forcing us to pray to a God that don't provide protection for foundational Black Americans and driving us away from the God our ancestors prayed to. So the conclusion to this is, in the period of slavery in Louisiana, hoodoo and related foundational Black American Creole religious practices, they endured a hostile onslaught of legal suppression and cultural demonization. Colonial codes, man, it forced outward conversion to Christianity, and it banned the very gatherings that sustain hoodoo religious practices. American state and city laws later sharpened these restrictions, effectively criminalizing the practice through things like curfew, assembly bans, and charges of fraud or disorder. Court cases and police raids punctuated the 19th century, making examples of hoodoo devotees in order to intimidate anybody who dared to practice their religion. Meanwhile, newspapers and popular literature fanned the flames of fear by portraying hoodoo as a sinister threat. They associated the religious practice with rebellion, race mixing, and satanic horror. All these efforts was rooted in the fundamental dynamics of white supremacy. The need to maintain absolute control over Black populations, bodies, minds, and beliefs. Hoodoo offered enslaved and free Black people a spiritual lifeline and a form of resistance, which is precisely why white authorities felt compelled to crush it, to beat it to the ground. But the early 20th century, Louisiana's traditional hoodoo religion had been driven mostly underground, surviving in the form of secret hoodoo practices or blended into church traditions. Yet, the very resilience of those practices, covertly preserved despite laws and prejudices, speaks to the critical historical truth. The enslaved of America fought to keep their heritage alive, even as the force of legal repression and cultural terror sought to erase it. If you made it to the end, you know one thing. Your boy FBA Stoic appreciates you. I know it's been a while since I've been back up on the channel. I was working on this book, and the book is fire. Please pick up the book on our foundational Black American lineage, legacy, and royal dynasty. Bloodlines of Fire, from royalty to slavery. The book breaks down how foundational Black American history didn't start in slavery. It started in royalty. Get the book, Bloodlines of Fire, The Legacy of a FBA Dynasty. It's in stores at KDP, Kindle, Amazon Prime, I think is what it's called. Whatever the case may be. But But cop the book. It's really giving some insight on a family, and it's giving a lot of insight on our heritage, our culture, and our bloodline. Peace, foundational Black American family. I'ma catch y'all in the next one.
They buried our names, rewrote our legacy. But through the ashes, the blood still speaks. From Moorish courts to Louisiana sugar fields, this is the true story they tried to erase. Nobility, reclassified, royalty enslaved. Yet the fire never died. It lives in the bloodline. This is more than history. It's restoration. It's reclamation. It's truth. Bloodlines of Fire. Available now on Amazon KDP.